Hey, this is Stuchiu, and for today's video, I wanted to talk about how not all championships are created equally, how some mean less than others, or how others mean more than lesser championships. And this topic was instigated, I guess, by me listening to the Listen Local podcast with Loco Doco and Thorn. And basically, the two of them talked about the idea of what it means to be great. And Loco Doco was more on the side of, well, players just want to get a shit ton of championships, bunch of rings, bunch of numbers next to their name. And then Thorn was more of the individualist, represented more of the old school. Is like, well, actually, some championships do mean more than others. And he brings up like the example of like Dirk Nowitzki and how his one title meant more than any you can measure it against anybody else's. And basically, it cut. Some people think of it like Loco Doco points out it might be a generational thing, but I actually don't think that's the case. And I actually think it's more of a maturation thing. Because if you think about the process of being great, like even in this generation of players and teams and whatnot, they always, I see almost all of them end up at the same place. And I'm going to get to that. But we'll first start with basketball, just as like a basic broad reference. So as everybody knows right now, basketball, or if you're not into it or whatever, but basically there's a bunch of super teams running around with, Kevin Durant and Golden State Warriors and whatnot. And what's interesting, I guess, about this dilemma, if you're looking at it from the outside perspective, is that basically, How do I frame this correctly? Okay, I'll put it like this, because it's not like I'm a huge basketball nerd. But as far as I can see, there's basically two players you can consider to be the best right now. LeBron James and Kevin Durant, right? And Kevin Durant has won more titles in the recent years than LeBron James. But he is far less satisfied than LeBron James, because even though he has the two finals MVPs, even though he got those two titles on Golden State Warriors, he hasn't gotten the accolades he was expecting, nor was he. And this isn't just because of the fact that he was, he's called a snake. He's like unpopular and kind of like joined a super team, and whatnot. It's also because he basically took what many consider to be the easy way out, as in he joined greatness. He didn't create greatness, and this is like the opposite of basically LeBron James' career, or basically he's starting at the beginning of LeBron James' career, because LeBron James started the Cavaliers, went to the Heat to create that super team. Once he got those titles on the super team, he did, that was a really good team. But then he went back to the Cavaliers, and then he beats the Golden State Warriors in the 3-1 reverse to take the titles 4-3, right? And what's interesting about this is basically LeBron had a comment where he was like watching the game, he was like, yeah, this is the one that made me the GOAT. And that's kind of where I'm going at, is even in this generation of ring chasers or whatever, like even fundamentally in something inside of them, they all know that there is championships and then there are championships. And of all the titles LeBron won, that's the one he knows is the one that will put him the argument and will potentially win the argument for him as the greatest of all time, because that was the hardest one against the hardest team, right? Whereas Kevin Durant, he can put up his titles, he can put up his numbers or whatever, but he has yet to win that title, that championship that could cement him as a GOAT candidate. And that's kind of the problem, because that's kind of what I'm going to get at this essential argument. So the reason I don't think it's a generation thing, it's more of a maturation thing, is because if you think about competition, if you just think about what it is metaphysically, competition is basically just a representation of life, if you want to think about it. And if you think about the way the competition works out, basically there are fundamental rules, there's a game, and then inside this game there is a competence hierarchy where you figure out how good you are, and then you're placed there, and then your entire goal is to try to go to the next level, go to the next level, go to the next level until you become the best. And then once you become the best, you learn that there's even greater levels. Like, it's not just enough to win a championship, but you can create an entire history, an entire legacy. And this is quite similar to how people live their lives, right? Because basically life is just a series of games, and you're just trying to win as many games as possible and trying to be better, get better and better at each of those games throughout life, right? But what makes sports or competition interesting is that it basically focuses down everything into this representational symbolic battle you kind of watch play out in real time. And when I think of just what life might mean, or what is the point of life or whatever, I actually think it always comes down to the exact same sort of scenario where you have to, once you break everything down and then you bring everything back up, it always comes down to the question of who you are and what you are and what is the greatest thing you can become. And that is why I think championships are always differentiated for every player. So that's why, like, LeBron thinks, and I think rightly so, that his greatest of all time championship was that 2016 one against the Golden State Warriors, is because that's the one that put him against the most struggles. That's the one that forced like his own personal expression of self to reach its highest apex of greatness, right? And now we're going to start going into esports examples, because that's just kind of the basic layout. But let's go first with 1v1 games, because I think in 1v1 games, like, if there was any argument that like one championship is the same as another championship, it would be in a 1v1 type of game, because if you think about it, you know, there's way less context surrounding each of the individual players. Yeah, you might have an easier run. Yeah, maybe the format's a bit less, a bit iffy at times, but the difference is there's like no team holding you back, or there's no team pushing you up. So you can't be like the Smiths and get a shit ton of majors and then try to pretend like you're better than Guardian. You're just not, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense. But in a 1v1 game, like a Smiths type character would get found out and kicked out of the GSL like style tournament, right? And so let's start with two, but let's start with the obvious comparison. So if you think, for instance, all right, in StarCraft 2, because that's the game I probably know the best for 1v1 games. If you're thinking about GSL championships, and if you truly think that one championship equals one championship, then I'd like to talk to you, because I want to know exactly why you think, for instance, Sniper's GSL title is worth as much as Soul Keys, or Jock G's, or MVPs, or Zest, right? Or any of these guys, right? Because the fundamental difference between Sniper and all the rest of these guys is, like, Sniper was playing in the Brewlord and Fester era, and this also goes for Roro too, who, like, everybody forgets him, and legitimately forgets him because he played in the Brewlord and Fester era, so nobody really respects those titles as much as the other titles. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is like, if you just compare purely to somebody like Sniper to, like, let's go with like a less popular GSL champion like Jock G, the difference between them is that Sniper played in the Brewlord and Fester era, and yeah, he was very good. Yes, he was top of the ladder at the time, but he will always have the context of getting the extra boost of power from that Brewlord and Fester meta that nobody else got, nobody else ever got, because I think that's literally the most imbalanced meta ever created in a game. Whereas Jock G, yeah, you can argue that Terran, when he won his title, like end of 2011, was a bit overpowered, or perhaps a bit more advantaged in the matchup, particularly against TVZ. But the reason everybody remembers Jock G is because of how that finals went down. Basically, Leenock went to MLG and he literally killed all of the best players. Killed all of them. And then he came back to GSL. So everybody was thinking in their minds, well, Leenock, it's his time now to win this title. But it didn't go out that way, because what happened was, even though Leenock played at his absolute maximum potential, like, I'm saying, he was balling out of control, Leenock. And Jock G, for that one day, he matched him head to head and beat him. And there's a lot of tactical stuff and a lot of nuance in that particular matchup. But basically, Jock G, the way he played it out, made that GSL finals one of the most memorable anybody had ever seen, just in terms of pure gameplay, right? And so that's why if I was ranking these GSL titles in terms of importance, I'd put Jockji over Sniper, because I think Jockji had more to fight against relative to Sniper. And when we're talking about 1v1 games, I think the actual best example is certainly got to be Daigo Umehara from Street Fighter fame, basically considered the greatest of all time. And he actually comes upon this realization very early on in his career, where he's very early on in his teens, basically. He won like 3 titles in a row, like Capcom National Championships in Japan. And what's crazy about those is like basically they're all best of ones in different games. So it's kind of wild he won all 3. But basically, at some point during his run, like one of the guys he played at the arcade with, at his locals, basically, as far as like the way Daigo recounts this, it's in an interview with Mad Catz and Seth Killian, was he played very, very similarly to Infiltration in 2013, which is the way Infiltration played back then was he was an incredibly safe player who kind of broke down the game by numbers. So the way he did it was he would play a very strong spacing game that basically eliminated all the options of the enemy and allowed him to have like safe options of attack, right? And then basically he just frustrate the enemy, zone them out, beat them, and then it was a complete stomp, but it wasn't like a fun stomp. It was just like, oh wow, he's clearly way better. And this is how Daigo used to play. And basically, if you think about the way that philosophically works out, basically what Infiltration is doing, he's like, I am negating all of your strengths, and I am playing into your weakness. And this is how Daigo used to play. And then somebody told him, well, listen, you are fantastic, like an older like Street Fighter player or something, basically told me, listen, you're fucking fantastic, but if you keep playing like this, nobody will ever accept the fact that you're better than them, because in their minds they'll think, well, he only played against my weakness. If we played a straight up fair match where I got to play my best against his best, I'd beat him, right? That's how like every fucking Street Fighter player, every fucking FGC guy in existence literally thinks. And so Daigo was like, that kind of like clicked a light bulb in Daigo's head, where he realized, if I want to be the greatest of all time, I can't run away from these people's weaknesses. I have to not only let them play their best style, I have to play their style into them, beat them at it, and then when I'm done, everybody will have to accept I am better. And that's basically what Daigo's entire career has been about. Even in this last tournament at the Mix-Up in France, he basically plays Punk in the exact same style as Punk. He's like, okay, I'm gonna fight you in an aggressive neutral game. I'm gonna stick to the ground, and we're gonna fight it out and see who's way better and who's better at that. Punk won that one, but it does basically. But if Daigo had won, and it was a very close series that basically went all five games in the reset bracket. If Daigo had won that series, Punk really couldn't say shit. Punk, because he basically played the exact same style Punk wants to play, and Punk would have to tip his head and say, you know what? He was better playing my style than I was. Like that's the goal of Daigo Umehara as a 1v1 player. That's always been his goal. It's also why he's like he gets hilariously upset all the time, is because if he knows a guy like John Choi or a Filipino champ, he will deliberately try to play into their strengths, and like their strengths really beat the shit out of Daigo's. So and what's interesting about Daigo is like he's technically part of the older generation. He's like 38 years old, right? But what he basically did is been copied or imitated throughout time in Street Fighter. And what I mean by that is like a bunch of different players have gone the exact same route Daigo did. And like the most recent one I can think of is actually Tokido. And Tokido was another Japanese phenom. Basically, what's interesting about Tokido is he played multiple games, but the way he tried to win was he tried to figure out what the cheapest option was. Cheapest being like easiest to execute, highest reward option. and he'd stick to that, and then he just beat people, and this always guaranteed him like a top 5, top 4 slot, potentially multiple championships. An incredibly strong player, an incredibly aggressive player. But as time went on, he started to realize there was like something strange about like the reception towards him, or perhaps towards himself. Because even though he was beating these people, like in the back of his mind, he always thought to himself, "Well, it's just because I'm using like cheaper characters, it's because I'm using like the obvious options or whatever." And then he eventually came to this realization after playing against Daigo a shit ton of times, or maybe watching Daigo, or I forget the exact timeline of where Takedo came to this weird realization, but he kind of realized like the way he was playing, it would always get him results, but would never get him. It never reached into, like, the best way I could describe it is he looked at it as a science. He looked at Street Fighter as a science before this revelation, and then afterwards he kind of realized this isn't the best I can be. Like, in order to be the best I can be, I have to focus on my own style. And then this is when he starts doing the meditation stuff. This is when he starts really honing in on his own play style instead of finding like cheapest options and executing those. He kind of starts playing more aggressive. He starts figuring things out, and then he comes to the exact same realization Daigo does, where he's like, well, if I want to be the best, I have to be Daigo. And in order to be Daigo, I have to prove to everybody in the world that I'm literally the greatest at every single style, that I could beat them at their best game. And that's basically been like Takedo's entire story in Street Fighter V, is trying to catch up to this shadow of Daigo in his mind, right? And I think as time has gone on, like, we just keep seeing this, even like the newer generation, where like it doesn't really matter if you win Worlds, if you win TI, if you win whatever, right? Like, every player ends up coming to this. Well, actually, TI is different because it's in Dota, and Dota is like an extremely individualistic style type of game. So we'll ignore that. But like, it doesn't really matter what other games you win. Like, in terms of the championships, like, every fucking player comes to this strange realization at some point where it's not necessarily about the titles you win, even though that's part of it, and that could be in and of itself a great legacy. It's just as much as how you won them and against what opposition. And one of like, start going to team games now, and one of the interesting examples of this I can think of is Eternal Envy from Dota 2. And what makes Eternal Envy interesting is like the amount of popularity it has. And I've always wondered what exactly it was, because it's not like he's the only like Dota 2 player who's super into like anime or whatever. But to be fair, like, I don't think anybody else is nearly as into anime as him. So maybe that's part of it. But I've personally always thought the reason like Eternal Envy was so beloved, at least in the beginning, was because he was so extreme in his individualism. This was a guy who, like, he wanted to be the best, and in order to be the best, he came to this conclusion: I can never team up with other TI winners. I have to not only be like a carry player, I have to be the leader, and I have to lead a bunch of new players or players that haven't been to the top. I have to lead them to the top. And this kind of culminates in the MLG run, which is arguably the most one of the most beloved runs we've ever seen in Dota 2. I'd say it was the most beloved run up until like OG 1 TI 8, right? And what was crazy about this run is like basically everything went against Eternal Envy and his team. Like, they had to have a stand-in. They had huge travel problems. When they got to the tournament, they like bombed out on the first day, and they were playing in a very strong meta, not strong meta, but very strong era where Alliance, Navi, DK were all in their prime still, and they made the run back all the way through, and they did it in a very Eternal Envy style, which is like end game. I will carry everything. We're going to do a lot of high speed movement. We're going to do this like almost tightrope walk to the edge, where if we fuck up once, everything is over. Incredibly fun to watch, and I think that's like, if you look at a bunch of titles throughout Dota 2 history, like a shit ton of them, there are very few you can say match up to. Like, if you're looking at an individual player's accomplishment as an individual player, like, there are very few that match up to Eternal Envy's MLG run there. Like, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is there are certain championships that just mean more than other championships. And when we go to like League of Legends, I think the obvious one is Crown, because after Samsung won the World Championship, basically Crown did this interview where he's talking about his fucking depression, and he's like, because he's talking about his depression, and he basically says this crazy line I always remember. He says, "Yeah, when I won that, it didn't really mean anything. Like, my team won, but I lost." And he basically goes on to say how he was fucking trash at that in the finals and in that tournament and in general, and how he wasn't good enough, and how he was basically just carried. And I always thought to myself, well, that's kind of like a very similar view to me. But I probably wouldn't have gone that far, but as you know, he did his role, he's part of the team, whatever. But and like, to be fair, like, Crown did carry them the year before that, and then they lost, so it's like fair play, I guess. Like, you carried and died, but then you got carried and won, so balance scales, right? But the thing is like, that's kind of like in the heart of hearts of every competitor. That's always the thing that like that gets to them, is like, you didn't take the hardest path possible. Like, there's always a question, there's always a doubt in your mind that you won, but you could have done something even greater, something even more. And that's kind of something that like digs into people, and that's basically how I think that's kind of what I got from that title, was like, even though he fucking won like the biggest achievement in League of Legends history, basically, like, you know, the Worlds, right? And even with that, he just couldn't be bothered. He's like, I didn't do anything to deserve this, and he's part of like the technical part of the new generation. So now we'll go on to like CSGO for a bit. And CSGO is a different game from Dota 2, from League of Legends, from Street Fighter and StarCraft 2, in the sense that even though it gets patched, it's not particularly patched very much. So there's a lot more continuity and consistency across the board, even with like the map changes and meta changes and all that. And the team I wanted to talk about is Fnatic, and I just mean the main three that were there from the beginning, and then were there at the end: JW, Flusha, Pronax, right? So in 2013, and they basically beat NIP in the finals to win a major, right? And then after that, they go on, team up with Olaf Meister, Krims, get to a bunch more major finals, end up winning 2 more: Katowice and Cologne. Now, if you think about it, which among those 3 majors do you think they revere the most? Like, I'd say it has to be Cologne. Like, the thing about the DreamHack Winter 2013 run is that basically the only person I think who could feel like that was the best accomplishment is probably Pronax, because he basically just surprised everybody with his style leadership in order to take that tournament win. But if we're talking about like as a team and in terms of the difficulties they had to face, I'd say ESL Cologne was their magnum opus. I think that what made that one so astonishing to me is basically Fnatic was early on the decline, and then a bunch of teams were on the come up. Envious and Virtus Pro in particular, but also like TSM. And what made that so astonishing to me was basically their paradigm shift had already finished, as in like people already understood how Fnatic was playing. Their individual form wasn't nearly as good as before. JW was already struggling, like he's already been in a slump basically. Olafmeister is good, but he's not that good. Krims is good, but he's not that great. Flusha is, Flusha, like he's good at moments, and Pronax was, Pronax. But what made that so fantastic was basically, in order to win that, they had to dig in so deep in terms of the clutch, the composure, fighting against everybody literally wanting them to lose, right? All that pressure and all that hatred and all that, everything just came together, and and basically it showed the very essence of what made them so fantastic. Like if you took away all of their skill, all their advantages, like the paradigm shifts, like how people understood how they played and all that, and they were on the decline. That particular tournament, in my view, was easily the most Fnatic of of all their tournaments. It was the realized potential of what they were, even in a situation where they should have lost multiple times, and they should have lost. They should have lost against Virtus Pro, and I'd argue they probably could have lost against MVS too. And that was absolutely fantastic. And I don't think I've ever heard of any analyst or any pro or anybody say something strange like, you know what, I actually think Fnatic Katowice was better than their Cologne. I've never heard that. Never heard that in my life. I don't think I ever will. So, like I said, some championships, like not all championships are created the same. Some mean more than others. And when I think about these various championships, right, and I think about the context of them, even if you're talking about from a pure casual point of view, even those guys who don't really like think about the game deeply on like a fundamentally analytical level or whatever, or even if you're talking about like casual walkabys who's like, oh, I'll watch a major, maybe I'll watch a TI, maybe I'll watch like a GSL finals or whatever, but I won't watch the rest of it because I'm not interested, right? Even those people will see, even those people can touch or feel like the depths beneath when an individual player like kind of ascends above everything. And part of it's potentially narrative, but a part of it is like basically what you're watching is the essentialized crystallization of what makes of like a very specific aspect of somebody's soul, and like that's what makes it so. That's why I think the difference between championships is basically how much individualism can a potential team or player show from that championship run. And the only way you can truly show like individualism, I think, is you have to do it in very harsh circumstances. Like if you think about like here's an example from the movie Free Solo, which is basically about mountain climbing, except you don't do it with any kind of gear, you just go up, right? And in that movie, Alex Honnold talks about how in order like he had to like climb El Capitan, which is like a gigantic fucking cliff, right? And the reason he does it is because he thinks that is like that basically, as far as I can tell, if you just look at him as a person and like what you see in the movie, is basically that is like who he was as an individual. Like in order to achieve perfection, in order to achieve what and actualize his potential, he had to face the harshest challenge he could think of, and being the man to free solo El Capitan, that was his white whale or whatever, right? And yeah, he could have done it, and he did do it without like with the ropes and all that shit. But it was never the same, because the chance of just straight up dying and having to be perfect and that extra pressure was something critical in improving to himself that was an accomplishment. And that's an extreme example, but it's basically the case when you're talking about championships, is you have to fight something extreme. Like obviously in the case of like OG, right? For TI8, that's easily the most extreme thing you'll ever see from a Dota 2 team, because they had basically, in order to win that TI, so many different things had to happen. First, they did a shuffle right before, and they didn't know about it, so Fly and S4 leave to EG. And so now they are without an offlaner, and offlaners are pretty rare, especially when they're as good as S4. They're without a captain, because Fly was technically their captain, and they're only like a few weeks out before the TI qualifiers start, and they have to start TI qualifiers. So they had to bring the whole crew back together. They had to bring Anna, and they had to bring Thompson in, right? And then they had to make Seb an offlaner. So this was like his third rule change that year or some bullshit. And then they had to change Anna to carry. Then they had to hope that Thompson as a rookie wouldn't like fuck up. Then they had to have No Tail go from carry to the 5, and then from there he also had to be the captain. And then they had to figure out an identity of what their heroes, of what their specialties were, and how they were going to play that into the meta. And then they had to play above the rim. Like Anna had to basically put the best performance of his life on the line. Seb had to like draft out of his fucking mind. Like everything had to go right for that team, and that's why I think everybody thinks that was like the fucking craziest TI run we've ever seen, right? I think craziest Dota 2 run we've ever seen. And the reason it's so beautiful is that it's basically, if you think about, just exclude all the outside narratives or whatever, like, it just look individually at the game. The reason OG won is because they, as players, ascended. Well, actually, there's a few reasons. First, I think their conclusion to the meta was more correct than LGD's, because I think LGD's was very counter to the meta, where like I think comeback gold was a critical thing, and so if you had an end game player like Anna, it makes a lot more sense to like, they weren't trying to lose lane, but like they were trying to get to the end game, which is a bit different from trying to win lane, win game, right? So I think in terms of the meta, it's certainly favored OG, but that plenty of teams actually figured that out besides OG, but like they all lost to LGD anyway. So what makes this so fantastic is what makes this particular run so fantastic from OG and from LGD is basically all 10 of those players basically realized the greatest potential expression of themselves in that finals and in that winners bracket, right? And I think that's what makes that so memorable to me, is basically this wasn't just like a weird underdog run. This wasn't just a revenge run. It was basically we got to see their purest expression of Dota 2, their purest expression of art in those finals and in that winners bracket, and that was what I remember from that. And I think you can talk about all the rest of the narrative stuff, but I think that like that's all just like window dressing for the artistic expression of greatness of these individual players in that environment. And I'll end this with, obviously, you know me, MVP, right? So among all the GSL, all the GSL runs, if you think about all the various ones, I think there's a reason why so many people, like, it's 2019 now, right? So it's been over 7 years since MVP won that GSL Season 2 finals against Squirtle. It's been over 7 years. It's been almost 7 years since he almost beat Life in that GSL Season 4 finals in 2012. Yet a lot of people still remember that. A lot of people still consider him like the greatest of all time, or at least within that conversation. And if you think about the amount of players that have come and gone, like MVP is actually just a very small part of StarCraft 2 history. If you just think about his peak period, it really is not even his peak period, like his like career as a relevant player. So I'd say from beginning of 2011 to the beginning of 2013, I'd say that's about it. So like 2 years and maybe a quarter, maybe 2.5 if you're being very generous. If you think about that, StarCraft 2 is run for way longer than that by now. It's run for nearly like 9 years. He has had less play. MVP has played less games, less tournaments than almost everybody at this point, all the top players at this point. But despite all that, despite like everything, basically everybody still remembers that. And the reason, like, tournaments come and go, like championships come and go, but the reason everybody remembers those particular ones are MVP. Well, all right, caveat, I did write a shit ton about MVP, so maybe that had to do something to do with it, but I doubt that, just because I don't think any esports writer at least can like so warp reality that they can stick a fucking memory inside people's brains and remember it for like 6, 7, 8 years down the line. I don't think that's possible. But maybe it is. But if we ignore all that, the reason I think people remember that particular run from MVP is because it basically showed the very essence of what MVP's greatness was. Because this is a guy who won with, as we later found out years later, like 5 slip discs, 2 in the neck, 3 in the back. He won his GSL Season 2 run with his worst matchup against, I'd say, the 3 best Prodosses at the time: Naniwa, Parting, Squirtle. Naniwa was at least the best 400 Protoss. I'd say he was at least top 5 among all Prodosses. Parting was easily the best PVT player. I'd say he was top 5 to top 3 among all Prodosses. Squirtle was the best Protoss player at the time, and I know some people are trying to like pretend he was like a Kong or whatever, but he was not a Kong yet. And maybe I'll go into that in some other case. But basically, I think Kongs are made rather than born. And in Squirtle's case, he actually showed very strong resilience in the IPL finals before that GSL finals, where he reset the bracket and then he just ran out of steam at the end because he was running on like a 15-hour day or 18-hour day at that point. And so he just like ran out of energy to keep fighting alive in that finals. And then even in this finals against MVP, you see incredible resilience from Squirtle because he was down. He was down 3-0. He makes it all the way back, and he denies the first all-in against MVP. But then MVP steals it. Like that's the essence of what MVP was, right? That's what made him so particularly special. And then he repeats like a freaking crazy run, goes to the GSL finals, and then loses to like Life in the Broodlord Infestor era, right? So just think about that. And then 1v1 game, we've had so many runs to the GSL finals, but if you wanted to find ones that match like the MVP runs, probably count them on one hand or two hands. Like the innovation run where he got second to Sulky was certainly one of them. But in general, like there are not like I'll end it at this. Like championships, I think are decided by like the importance of a championship in my mind is decided by the amount of self-expression a team or player can output, and that is decided by the amount of difficulties they had to face, because the difficulties forced them to dig even deeper. And that's also why, like, one of my favorite teams in CSGO history is like Virtus Pros, because they always forced the other team to dig as deep as possible to beat them, right? And if you do that, then you get an amazing like piece of art, amazing piece of expression, like a crystallization of pure human potential at its apex for this very specific facet of video game play, right? So that's why I think not all championships are the same. That's why I think the idea of thinking that you just get a shit ton of titles will somehow put you in will somehow let you rest easy at night. I don't think that's the case. I think individual greatness is generally the better way to go. And I think you see that, like I said, in the NBA, like Kevin Durant's not satisfied, LeBron is. It's because they had different paths, and one of them did try to carry like LeBron. Kevin Durant just joined just joined the super team, wasn't particularly like satisfied, even though he won like 2 finals MVPs and whatever. So that's it. See you guys later.